I suppose, like a lot of people who live in households where it would seem everyone else runs around turning on the lights, I run around turning them off. Being Scrooge-ish, I guess I like to keep the electric bill to a minimum. And then sometimes when my simple act of turning switches off gets tiresome, I begin, being the preacher I am, resorting to verbal pronouncements about the gloriousness of life if only everyone would turn out those lights. This perhaps might be all well and good if it weren't for the fact that occasionally I'm returning to a spot where I myself have left the light on. I suppose if we didn't have to pay for it, I might well leave a lot of lights on because I like a lot of light. I've often mused that if I was in a dream house, it would have a certain portion of it devoted to a glass roof. I even have pondered what it might be like if our current home were to have skylights installed. Every one of my age group knows well enough the crucial nature of having enough light to see the greater subtleties in life, especially as vision would seem to become more challenging. But the field of ophthalmological treatment in recent years has skyrocketed in its ability to deal with the limitations of and impairments in vision, often profoundly improving it for thousands, no, millions of patients with cataracts and other problems, with now increasingly routine surgeries and laser treatments. Indeed, our sense of sight is rather crucial, and we've come a long way in how to attend to it, though it still falls short, as we know, of being perfect. Thus, in an era when we take for granted the ability to flip a switch, to flood a whole area with light strong enough to more than adequately inform our vision, and when we can even fix many of our eyesight limitations, we might easily overlook what it was like for our predecessors. In biblical times, ophthalmology, as we know it today, was virtually non-existent, although apparently some, now brace yourself, rudimentary though radically uninformed cataract procedures were experimented with hundreds of years before Christ, I believe around 500 or 600 BC. The famous philosopher Aristotle, something of our earliest of scientists, did much to correct some rather misguided notions about our basic understandings of how our eyes worked. Apparently, the first recorded use of a lens, which took the form of water in a curved container, happened during the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero, only a couple of decades after Jesus' life on earth. But it wasn't really until, perhaps appropriately enough, the Enlightenment, that the production of corrective lenses started coming into its own, with increasing sophistication in a number of different centers in Europe and England, although crude lenses were used before that, including some colored ones in China as sunglasses. Were the Chinese the first to see through rose-colored glasses, perhaps? Well, what are we to make of this ancient story of Jesus near the pool of Siloam, where he combines his own saliva and mud to form some kind of ophthalmic solution that provides sight to a man who has been born blind from birth? Who's been blind from birth. This story of the healing of the blind man. Well, perhaps to the relief of our resident optician, it is important for us not to be too literalist in our interpretations of these biblical stories. But just because we suggest that such stories are not to be taken as fact, it doesn't mean that they are without truth and value for our understanding in life. As in our own time, Jesus lived in a world where there was more than one kind of blindness. There was that type had by the man whom we just spoke about that Jesus healed. Then there was another common type of blindness that was apparently quite infectious and aggravated by the commonly dusty and glary, brightly sunlit environment of the Middle East. And then, of course, there was blindness that gradually encroached with increasing age. But the Bible also refers to other types of blindness, including that which results from malaria, and that of a temporary sort which the Apostle Paul experienced on his famous road to the city of Damascus. But what needs to be seen here, if you'll forgive me using a visual term, is that the Bible is immersed in talk about the ability to see and the intimately related subjects of light and darkness. Perhaps unlike our own modern and many would say rather privileged day, when we carefully carve out the existence for people who have visual impairments, with all sorts of aids and gizmos and adjusted environments, things were a whole lot tougher for those who were blind in Jesus' day. They were regarded as among the most pitied of people. And regrettably, people with such afflictions often were also conceived of as having brought on the affliction themselves through their own behavior, a sort of divine response to their having sinned. And Jesus' passage that we read earlier corrects that aptly. Be that as it may, anyone who put blocks in the way of the blind or failed to help them, as the book of Deuteronomy shares with us, would bring a curse upon themselves. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, one of Jesus' first pronounced missions is to bring recovery of sight to the blind. And in the opening of the story we read from John, we hear Jesus proclaim, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Indeed, without light, we have no sight. And without sight, it would seem we cannot know the light. Now, all this might seem rather basic and straightforward to we who are blessed with an advanced understanding of the science of optics and ophthalmology, but we ought not to jump too quickly here. Even our understanding of these sciences as they relate to the modern physical world isn't altogether clear and in focus. Physicists, for example, speak of light according to two and even more theories. They speak of light waves, of which we apparently only can see a narrow spectrum of, and they speak of light particles, some of which apparently pass right through our bodies. Kind of a weird sort of thing. Two explanations and more, often combined in the world of physics. But these things are just that. They are things. And the story of Jesus' healing of the blind man reaches beyond things of the material world, beyond the world of physics, to address something of our spiritual nature. Victor Hugo, in that popular play Les Miserables, knew that when he remarked in passing that to be blind and beloved may, in this world where nothing is perfect, be among the most strangely exquisite forms of happiness. The supreme happiness in life, he said, is the assurance of being loved for oneself, even in spite of oneself, and this assurance the blind man possesses. In his affliction, to be served is to be caressed. Does he lack anything? No, says Hugo. Possessing love, he is not deprived of light. A love, moreover, that is wholly pure. There can be no blindness where there is this certainty. And this love of which Hugo speaks is a thread throughout the Bible. Thus, we ought not to limit ourselves to understanding it purely literally. A purely literal understanding of the Bible cannot withstand the scrutiny of the modern intellect. But again, to say that the Bible isn't always to be taken literally isn't to say that it shouldn't be taken at all. Now, before you think this may not be worth looking at, consider the fact that the creation of the world, as conceived by the writer of the book of John, is by God, who is light, and in him, John tells us, is no darkness at all. That is, God, in a sense, is absolutely not blind. He is proclaimed to be omnivisual. He sees everything. Remember, even the little sparrow fall. And if we go further back, God is author of himself, as the book of Genesis reminds us in its opening pages, where he pronounced, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And to be sure, nobody was running around shutting off the lights at this point in the creation story. That's where the later shadows of ignorance and sin come in, the subsequent creation story, and we might argue through the course of much of the history of humanity. Couldn't we easily put forward the idea that history is really recounting the events of periodic blindness and the consequences thereof, or selective, if not demented, focusing? But again, this isn't just a physical blindness. More critically, it is a spiritual blindness, the failure to see the light whom is God. In our local library, like most libraries, close to the entry they shelve some of the most recently published controversial and or popular books. I always like to look at that shelf to see what's going on. The other day I picked up a book there called A Manual for Creating Atheists. Now you might think that's a little strange for someone like me to pick up. It's written by Peter Boghossian, a provocative writer. I didn't quite finish it, as apparently it was so popular somebody put a hold on it, so I had to take it back. But I got enough to glean from it that it was the author's intention or mission, if I can use that word, to be part of a movement that seeks to counteract thousands of years of people in increasingly refined sorts of ways trying to indoctrinate or to proselytize others to abide by one holy book or another, as he puts it, and to persuade them to believe in their particular faith or brand of religion. Now, before the faithful get their backs up, the genuine earnestness of striving to do what someone believes is a service to mankind is to be commended. Most people who don't go to church or deal much in the way with religious issues in their lives are seldom as intentional about their atheism and agnosticism. But of course, Mr. Boghossian is not entirely alone. He lines up with a number of some of the world's most well-known non-believers, including the so-called Four Horsemen of the modern atheistic charge. And of course, we could go further back to a slew of the world's most famous philosophers, like Bertrand Russell, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, Jean-Paul Sartre, Friedrich Nietzsche, or go further back to the illustrious Theodorus the atheist. And well, the list is very, very long. But it should be acknowledged through the course of history that such views have taken great courage to express in a world that was perhaps more divinely, but also admittedly often more superstitiously tilted. But it still comes down to how we see the layout of the eye chart of life on the wall, doesn't it? Do we see evidence of God? Well, that brings me to the punchline of today's sermon, and that has to do with the fact that what we are looking for, we cannot see, but for our spiritual blindness. Much as the Bible appeals to physical imagery to explain spiritual realities, what we are looking for is the unseen. This is no less conceivable and may in fact be thought of as quite congruous with the physicist's suggestion that the whole of the universe may have issued forth from some virtually inconceivable black hole in some kind of indescribable Big Bang. And in the midst of the darkness, there issued forth a great, albeit rather inexplicable, light. Our atheistic author lineup, essentially, they are preaching to the world that this light should be switched off, or even that they don't see this light at all. And they form a perspective that no claim can be made about that light. Now you may say all this doesn't really amount to a hill of beans, especially in terms of the routine rigors of daily life. Who has time to sit around and argue one way or the other? Well, I'm here to proclaim that it does matter more than a hill of beans. For to be spiritually blind is to be prone to wander, no less than a physically blind person amidst the ever-changing geography of life. It is to have no spiritual bearings in life. Our disposition on spiritual issues makes us who we are. This is not just the stuff of philosophers' armchair debates, it is real life. It determines whether we go this way or that, or whether we feel this way or that, or not. This is of great consequence, and modern people quite often forget this. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus Christ as your heavenly Lord and Savior? Answers to this question can change your life. The answers to such questions cut through to the deepest darknesses within our souls and enlighten even the blackest holes within. We have often been told by the media that ours is one of the most depressed and medicated societies that has ever been. Could this be why? The church has probably never struggled in the many and perplexing ways as much as it has for the past few decades. Could this be why? Too many of us are ready to ignore or even unthinkingly toss out the spiritual component of our life and yet feel a certain radical emptiness. Could this be why? Jesus heard that they had thrown the blind man out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. I remember as a young, well, maybe not so young, but an older teenager, when I would go out to explore the darkness of the night, and my mother would stand at the door terribly worried. And her last words would be, "I'll leave the light on." A light to come home to. It means more than we know. Have you ever been to a cottage or a campsite and gone out in a boat in the darkness, or come home in the darkness of night, and that light on shore? That's crucial, isn't it? The light means more than we know. It is no different for the nights of our spiritual life. The Spirit and love of Jesus Christ, they're crucial. Leave the light on and see how glorious life can be.